And tonight we are here with Catherine Orr, the Executive Director of the Roundtable for Catholic Social Action Directors. This session will be recorded for our Center for Mission YouTube page. My name is Adam Fitzpatrick. I am the Social Mission Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Mission, and this is part 2 of our Fratelli Tutti series. Tonight we're looking at chapter 3, and we're going to be opening with our prayer to the Creator, which is found at the end of Fratelli Tutti. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So tonight we have Catherine Orr, the Executive Director of the Catholic Roundtable of Social Action Directors. That is a mouthful. I think Catherine embodies so much of what we want to discuss tonight in chapter 3 in terms of openness to other people, in terms of solidarity. And I think a personal story will kind of help give the background on why I respect Catherine so much in this regard. So I was new to social ministry and kind of struggling with my own confidence as I had started in this position, because I had just hopped up from a parish position to a leadership role for the Archdiocese. And I was not really sure what being a regional or a national leader meant. And Catherine connected to me through a mutual friend of ours, Kelly Hickman, who is just a great leader in social justice out in Washington. And Catherine and I just clicked very quickly in terms of our personalities. And she gave me a lot of confidence that I could do my job well, even when I was not sure that I could do my job well at all. I mean, she has been a stable source of friendship and just an outstanding leader. There was actually one section we were talking about in terms of like interrupting our day. And do we interrupt our day? Thinking back to the parable of the Good Samaritan last week for the person that's suffering in the midst of the road. And Catherine's done that for me numerous times and has been, I could have a problem with something at work where I'm just not sure how to approach a certain situation. And Catherine will always say, hey, I've got time tomorrow. Let's have a Zoom. We'll talk about it. And it's been a blessing to be her friend. And I'm glad that she's here to bless us with her wisdom tonight. So now, Catherine Orr, do you have anything more you want to add about yourself? And then if you can give some general thoughts on chapter 3 of Fratelli Tutti to start us off.
Well, that's probably the best introduction I've ever had for a session like this. And just thank you for that. I, first of all, just want to say thank you for the invitation to speak here to all of you. And I'm just grateful for everyone who took the time out of their busy schedules to Zoom in and to talk about Fratelli Tutti, especially chapter 3, which does resonate a lot with me, and we'll talk about that. But I also, I have to say hi to some of my fellow roundtable members. I see Rita and Patrice and Tom Navin and Clayton, and it's so wonderful to see your faces and your names. Because the Roundtable Association of Catholic Diocesan Social Action Directors, which, yes, is a mouthful, has been an organization that I've been associated with for, almost 10 years now. I've been serving as a staff person, as a program coordinator for the Roundtable for the past 4.5 years. But previous to that, I did serve on the board and I have just always appreciated the work that the organization does to support those in social ministry, whether they're at a diocesan level or a Catholic Charities agency, or if they're working at a parish or a school. I found a home with Roundtable in the sense that it was like-minded individuals trying to build up God's kingdom of justice, love, and peace. And sometimes you're a part-time person working a few hours here and have another job, and you can kind of feel isolated when you're trying to tackle some really big issues that Pope Francis talks about within Fratelli Tutti. And the camaraderie and the support within Roundtable has always been a great source of it's been a great source of support for me in my ministerial efforts. And I think that's why I've appreciated serving in the coordinator role for the last 4.5 years, because then I've been able to be a support to others in this capacity as well. Simultaneously to my role with Roundtable, I also have the privilege of working at a parish within the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. I serve as a pastoral associate that is a staff liaison to our St. Vincent de Paul Conference and our Human Concerns Commission, as well as a few other of our commissions at the parish. So I have a unique opportunity to be able to have some of these national level conversations within my Roundtable work to see how that work is then being applied to parish life, and how that information is being infused into our parish social concerns committee, which it does take more time. So it's fun to kind of be able to have these dual roles and to see how social ministry is growing in each of these capacities. Like Adam said, I've been working for the Roundtable and doing the parish work. I am also hoping and praying that my 2 children do not come barging in here right now. My husband is downstairs with them. They should be getting ready for bed soon, but if you hear them or see them, I apologize. It will be an interruption, but we will keep moving forward with it. I've been married for almost 8 years. My son will be 6 in April, and my daughter is turning 4 next week. So it's busy time, and it's a lot of fun. And thank you, Patrice. I know you've been there too. It's just for all the individuals who, parents get interruptions. It's for those who have, yes, virtual learning, and the time of COVID has been a interesting last couple of months. But I'm just really grateful for like I said before, the opportunity to talk about, in particular, Chapter 3 of Fratelli Tutti. I really appreciated being able to, just my general remarks on this, of how Pope Francis was able to take a look at not only some very micro level conversations of how we interact with one another on an individual basis, but then really how he was able to highlight the need to go beyond ourselves, to go beyond our immediate circles, and really look at institutional structures at an international level on how we are truly responsible for our sisters and brothers across the globe. And it makes a lot of sense to be able to really highlight how he embraced and really just dove into the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I know you talked about that in the previous session, and using that as a springboard then to really highlight and talk a lot about love and what is love, who is love, God is love. What does that love compel us to do? And what does that love call us to? And it's beyond ourselves. So it takes a lot of nuance to be able to try and navigate and hit on a variety of these issues. But he was also very clear about the need to look at some of the structures that are in place, both nationally and especially internationally, that hinder people's ability to truly and authentically develop and to honor their innate human dignity. And it may seem like it's kind of overwhelming when trying to look at some of these big issues, but for me, he has a wonderful way of making it seem not too overwhelming, that I can follow his train of thought. I can follow where he's going, what he's calling us to do, what the gospel is calling us to do. and how do we apply that then to our own particular situation. So I'm just thrilled to be here and looking forward to our conversation this evening.
Wonderful. And I think that's some great opening thoughts. And for everyone that is attending tonight, if you have questions, please put them in the chat at any time, and then we will collect those for our Q&A session. And we might, depending how many questions there are, we might rearrange some of the timing of this so we can make sure we can get to your questions. All right. So you were talking about being open to more immediate circles than just your family. So how do you live that? How do you live that out?
Well, I think for me, it's really important to kind of take a look at and analyze like who are in my immediate like circles. A lot of that is it's my husband, my children, people I work with, and it's my community. But then it's trying to take a look at like is there a diversity of thoughts and opinions and individuals within that? Who am I communicating with on a regular basis? Because what is important to remember for us too is that like we are all human beings, we are social creatures. And in order to be in communion with one another, we truly do need to be able to understand and honor the innate dignity that each person has. So what Pope Francis has been able to do within this document before he starts kind of unfolding more what this concept and what this idea of social friendship looks like at an international level is that he diving down into, well, as social creatures, we have to look first and foremost at the individual. And we are created in the image and likeness of God. And with that, we have innate dignity and inalienable rights that have to be honored. And how do we do that if we're only looking to our own immediate circle? And I'm closing off my eyes and my heart to individuals who are around me who might be suffering. And we don't always have to look very far, although later on in this chapter, he calls us to look farther, look beyond the circles, even within our immediate vicinity. But that's why the parable of the Good Samaritan is so beautiful, because the Samaritan person, he was looking at the person right in front of him. But then it goes on to see how that had other impacts or lasting impact to the innkeeper and larger circles beyond that. And for an innkeeper to be able to see how a Samaritan is helping a Jewish man, it's different, and it has that ripple effect. But the whole idea is that life is sacred, it is a gift, and it's meant to be at the service of other people. And if we're trying to hoard our time and hoard our love only for those who are directly associated to me, then we're failing to live out our call to love. And that's what I think is really beautiful within Fratelli Tutti, and because Pope Francis emphasizes more that this love is calling us beyond those circles. And for me, in my experience and with my work, I just have the privilege to be able to work with individuals through Roundtable who are around the country. And that helps me have a wider circle. It helps me to see how individuals are ministering in their own dioceses around the country. Just the fact that, we have Rita in Nevada, Patrice and several in Minnesota, Clayton's coming from Virginia. Tom, I think I don't know if you're in Ohio or Kentucky area. Having that broader perspective is important, because even though each area has unique challenges, has unique issues that they're trying to address and look at, there still is commonality in it, because we are all individuals created in God's image. And just the fact that there's most you're probably familiar with it, a beautiful icon of the Trinity. I think it's from, I'm going to butcher it. It's a Russian iconographer, Rublev, maybe.
Yeah, Rublev is correct.
Thank you. I was like, oh, please don't fail me now, history. But that idea of that we are created in God's image, and we are a reflection of a Trinitarian God, three divine persons. and have different roles, but they are in communion with one another, just like we are to be in communion with one another, regardless of if you're living down the street or you're living across the world. And it's trying to have that greater understanding and an openness to learn, because each person in their area will have, like I said, unique challenges, unique strengths and unique gifts. And it's just trying to allow ourselves to create that space to have the openness to listen to one another.
Yes, and that disposition to listen to others and engage with where they are at it's a challenging disposition to have, because it makes sense that we want people to be more like us and have some similarities and have a kinship with the people that are the similarities. That's you get those positive moments, but we need those encounters with people that are different than us, because it's very easy to get stuck in our own little bubble and get stuck with our own preferred images of God or images of the way we want the world to be. And we need to take that step back and really engage in listening. Do you have any practices in your own family that you do to encourage that solidarity?
We try to. I am laughing because I think we've had to establish some family ground rules that we will not have heated conversations if like there's alcohol involved, because that just tensions will. I come from an Irish German family, so we are all stubborn and very hot-headed. So we have also learned too that, okay, have to remove that. If it's a family get together celebrating like a birthday, probably not the most opportune time to start bringing up like all of these challenges or ways we disagree. But we've also, I think what's been really helpful is that we have set like very intentional time limits on conversations, because what we have run the risk of doing, and this is where I think our family has learned, is that oh my gosh, my brother and my dad would be the perfect example. They could go round after round for hours, to the point where it's just the two of them in the living room. I purposefully was standing in the kitchen doing dishes just so I didn't have to engage in the conversation. And finally, it was my mom that was just saying, like, you two want to go at it. You have 30 minutes and then you're done. Because to have an honest dialogue with individuals, you also have to be in a good headspace for it, and really want to actually listen to what the other person says. Because I mean, we've talked about this, especially those who've been in ministry for a while, about what sacred listening is. Sacred listening is honoring the dignity of that person, and even though they might have a different viewpoint than I do, we have to be able to still honor the fact that they are a child of God, and not want to try and persuade them. And Pope Francis talks about this in chapter 3, showing love to a person. And I've been told to listen is to love. You have to be able to not want to change a person's mindset, or really try and enforce your own ideological preferences or proselytizing on a person, but to honor where they're at in that moment, and to really truly listen without wanting to have a quick response. So our family too, we've also, we hold each other accountable, which sometimes it goes better than others, by saying, I don't think you really heard me. I don't think you're really listening. Maybe we should revisit this another time when we're both in a better space to do that. And just honoring that, because sometimes, this level of conversation, especially when we disagree on a variety of things. And I keep thinking from this past year with the election within my family, as I'm sure many people have also experienced, not everybody agreed on their particular candidate and some of the policies and things like that. And we'd get into lots of heated debates. So putting it on a time limit, trying to hold each other accountable, actually really listening. Those were some of the things that have been, and not doing it at 2 a.m. after you've had a couple beers is also preferable.
I've definitely had those discussions at the wrong time, and it has never ended up well. It's usually just you end up having to have a lot more discussion later to be like, hey, we're okay, right? And those just aren't fun discussions to have. It's kind of better to know what your own limitations are when you are seeking to engage in a dialogue, because it is that sensitive point.
Right. But you're right, though. It's recognizing, like, just like what you said of where you're at. And then you have to be vulnerable with one another. But also what I've found, and I keep thinking back to my older brother because we've had some, we've had some fun conversations. But it's going back after the fact when we probably had a conversation that went too far. It got more heated than we both wanted to, but going back and saying, hey, I wasn't able to clearly articulate really what I wanted to express. And I hope you're able to see. And it's almost then a second opportunity to revisit it with cooler heads, which I've been able to find helpful. And I don't know about you, but I have been told from my husband that I like to think I know everything, and I don't. So that has been, it's also a humbling experience too, because we don't know everything. And that's why really trying to force myself to truly listen, and to listen, not to respond, that's been something that I've learned to do over the last several years, which has been helpful.
Great. All right. So we've been talking about solidarity. So what is Pope Francis saying about solidarity in this document? And how have you felt called to live out this solidarity in your own life, particularly the quote with the interrupting your own journey for others? I really liked that quote that you had presented to me. So
Yes. So Pope Francis has a lot to say about solidarity, and I am not going to regurgitate a lot of that information because his words are obviously much better than mine. But I would encourage you to really kind of take a look at like paragraphs, really going back to like 91 through 94, because he takes a step back before he really engages in the concept of what solidarity is. He goes into an in-depth kind of description of what love is. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier, of saying that, love is the ability to think of others before ourselves. It's self-giving. It's looking at the other person and having a culture of encounter. Because when we go beyond ourselves, we're able to expand and enrich our own lives as well as the lives of individuals. And it's really helpful because solidarity is one of those concepts within Catholic social teaching, which is very misunderstood in a variety of ways. And the principles of Catholic social teaching of human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity really can't be divided, because they work in communion with one another. Obviously, those concepts, solidarity and subsidiarity, are rooted to life and dignity of the human person, but the three of them don't really make sense if you try and pull them apart. And he gave a great definition of solidarity in here. And hold on, I want to see if I can pull it up and find it. Hold on. I think it's within paragraph 94. He gets a little bit closer. Well, he's talking more about love. He says, our love for others for who they are moves us to seek the best for their lives. Only by cultivating this way of relating to one another will we make possible a social friendship that excludes no one, and a fraternity that is open to all. So the idea of solidarity is really, again, opening ourselves up to other individuals who have completely different perspectives than us, who will be able to challenge us, to be able to stretch our thinking. But it really is a wonderful opportunity to take a look at, again, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Samaritan person was traveling on the road to Jericho and saw a person that was in grave need of help. And that idea of having a broader sense of community, a community-based lens that went beyond their borders of being a Jewish person or a person from Samaria, just recognizing that common humanity. And solidarity is what does that. It recognizes the common humanity within each of us and calls us to honor that. And I want to also go back to just a quick little side note on it. So think it was like 5 years ago when I went to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage there, I was able to kind of go up this one little mountaintop, and our tour guide showed us, it was an overlook of the valley. So it was from the route from Jerusalem to Jericho. And we were able to overlook the monastery of St. George's. And what was wonderful about that perspective and that moment was the fact that we were overlooking this valley. And on the sides of it, there's just these huge cliffs going up on either side. And it did look very remote. And it, at the time, throughout this parable, was a commonly traveled route that was prone to robbers because of the natural, the cliffs and the natural route itself. And for me, I just looking at that was terrified, and truly was able to look at the Jewish person that was robbed and thinking, oh my goodness, I could very easily see how this could happen, and recognizing how far you were from both of those cities, and that he really was completely dependent on the help of another person to stop and aid him, and probably would have died if that person did not help him. So I think that that idea of an interruption to recognize the common humanity, to be in solidarity with another person, we have to be able to open our eyes to and open our hearts to those interruptions around us. And we were just kind of joking at the start of our time together that, parents are intimately aware of interruptions, but so are those working in social ministry. I mean, how many times do you have a to-do list a mile long, trying to tackle 3 of them for the day to feel productive, and somebody, knocks on your door pre-COVID, or they call you up and say like, hey, I'm really struggling. Do you have a couple minutes? Well, for me, a couple minutes, usually that's an indicator of like, okay, this is not going to be a couple minutes. It's probably going to be an hour and a half, maybe, or longer. And we have to be okay with that, okay with setting aside our agendas, and okay with the fact that I'm probably not going to get done any of the things on my to-do list today. And that's hard. And I think that's something that Pope Francis alludes to within this document, is that those interruptions we have to be okay with. And it's challenging, though, because as he goes on to talk about this, the work of building up just structures that honors a way in which people can fully develop, that requires time and persistence. But how do you strike the balance between continuing to do your work and be a good steward of your time and your resources, but also recognizing Christ in the person who just either showed up at your office or just called you up on the phone? And that's where I'm a type A person, and there are times when that is a true struggle of, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this day? But at the same time, I had a former supervisor of mine told me that, especially parasocial ministry, it is a ministry of interruptions, and the work will get done. We'll continue to keep on in that, but don't let a to-do list negate the importance of the person who is Christ right in front of you. And to be present to that person, that's something that I have really appreciated, having the multiple opportunities within work at Roundtable and at Parish Life too, because it's within those moments, that vulnerability, when you have that encounter, that culture of encounter that Pope Francis has talked about in all of his previous writings, so that you are able to build a greater sense of solidarity, which pulls you outside of yourself. It pulls you outside of your immediate circles. So that's where it's all connected. It's just trying to be able to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and I mean, I say this not as a type A personality, but interruptions are hard for me too. I mean, I definitely know what I actually have to get done, but I'm also like, all right, well, this is going to be half hour. Oh, this email, well, this person needs a response, be another half hour. And then before I know it, it's lunchtime. And I'm like, oh, well, what happened to my day? I was like, oh, I was responding to people who needed my attention. So
absolutely. And I mean, what's nice about, especially with his description of solidarity, he did want to ground it. And I know I keep kind of reiterating this, but I found it very impactful for me. because solidarity is such a misunderstood term, and he gives more of a definition in it in paragraphs 115 and 116. And just briefly, he says, solidarity finds a concrete expression in service. And service in great part means caring for the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. But it also means more than sporadic acts of generosity. So that's where it's important to ground that understanding in love, because Adam and I were chatting about this beforehand. When you start talking about solidarity and some of the other concepts that we're going to talk about later, people will say, I don't know how many times, that's communist theory, or what are you talking about? And it's just like, no, it's Catholic. We're called to love and care for our neighbor. And so I see some people laughing, and they probably have experienced that as well.
Yeah, and especially it's because it's such a unique concept, and one that really gets highlighted in Catholic social teaching and not in a lot of other places. It'll be helpful for us to kind of articulate that more as we go in on our discussion tonight. So how do we cultivate a social friendship in the midst of a pluralistic society when many of our appeals for the common good have often come at the cost of minority communities?
That is a great question. And one that I was just like, wow, what can I add to this? But I think the biggest thing that I took away from this chapter in particular is looking at it from a community-based mindset, pursuing the common good. And obviously, like, Pope Francis wrote this to the entire world, and I'm coming at it from a Midwestern, from the United States, like Western culture perspective of it. But it was helpful looking back at this chapter in lieu of the past year. Obviously, the entire world has been dealing with COVID. In the US particularly, went through a very contentious election. There had been a lot of social unrest because of several of the deaths of persons of color in completely unjustifiable manners. And it continued to highlight the great need for continued work to eradicate what the bishops had called the first, social sin of racism in the country. And a lot of that, what Pope Francis had talked about, is the need to look at social and political structures within our institutions, because several of them were established to continually try to focus power, privilege, wealth for one community over another. And what Pope Francis is calling us to do is to look at community that does not have borders, does not recognize individuals based off of their race or gender, but it's looking at it from a very humanistic, child of God perspective. And I think, from a personal standpoint, one of the things that I have found most helpful when trying to cultivate this sense of what social friendship is by reflecting a lot more on the Beatitudes, because that is a type of a lifestyle, one that embodies servant leadership and recognizes that there is suffering and vulnerability in the world, but that we are also called to do something about it. So the idea of those who are blessed, or those who are poor in spirit, those who are mourn, those who are searching and seeking for righteousness, those who are merciful, all of that, those who are peacemakers too. Gosh, we need peacemakers more than ever now, with the level of violence that has happened not only within our own country but across the world. And it's trying to embody that lifestyle, those elements that are calling us to how we should be responding has been helpful for me. But I think that this continues to be a challenge, and how our country in particular is recognizing the fact that we have done a great disservice to the communities of color in a variety of ways. And now, what are we going to do about that? And that's where I think Pope Francis, within this chapter, calls us to a greater sense of fraternity, the social friendship. And within that, when we cultivate that friendship, that level of fraternity, we find liberty and freedom within that. So he's weaving together some very American concepts, and he's probably very wise in doing that, knowing what was going on in our country. But again, he was writing to the entire world, not just from a Western perspective. And those, again, are concepts that are core to American culture. But how do you do that in a way that, again, goes outside of your very immediate circle and has diversity, diverse voices, diverse reflections of people from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, gender diversity with that. We have to have different perspectives and recognizing that we come from things with different experiences, different beliefs, different values. But when you really try to boil down to the core of it, we are children of God that are called to be in communion with one another, to be in friendship with one another. So how do we reconcile that in the midst of great injustice? And so I would actually love, if we have time for small groups, to hear what other people's thoughts are on that too, because I'm going to be really honest. This is a question that is extremely challenging for me, and I'd love to gain some wisdom from others here.
Yeah, and I kind of put that question in there, kind of combining some other thoughts we had, because I didn't want to have just all softball questions here. I wanted to kind of keep wanted to keep you on your toes a little bit. I also, in that question, it's like I'm trying to, because I'm in St. Paul, I want to be cognizant of, we've had a lot of racial unrest with unjust killings of African Americans. We've had, and we don't need to necessarily rehash that whole history here, but it's on top of my mind when looking at solidarity, that we have to be examining the concrete incidents where we've seen abuses against solidarity. And so it was good to kind of bring that question up. I think you gave a good response there. I know this one's your favorite, so I want to make sure we have some time for this. So how do you understand Pope Francis's reiteration of the universal destination of goods and the secondary right to private property? And how does this affect your own desire to work for the common good?
It sounds like such a dry question, but honestly, there is such richness in this teaching. And this is kind of where I can get on my soapbox. So please tell me if I am, and I will stop and tone it down. But the universal destination of goods, I think it was this portion of Catholic social teaching that really I had an awakening to the fact that the church has this richness and this depth on a variety of social issues that I was just not aware of growing up. And my family, I mean, we pretty much lived at church, and we were engaged and involved, and we lived Catholic social teaching, but we didn't necessarily name it. And it was when I first started in ministry that I was going through a certificate course. And I want to say also, I think it was a resource out of the Diocese of Joliet, but we read the entire compendium of the social doctrine of the church, which is like reading the catechism. It can be very dry, but there's so much within it. And it was this particular teaching on the universal destination of goods and the right to private property that just really kind of blew me away on how are we not talking about this more? And why is it still so misunderstood? Because this is the area, when I start getting into this, when I've been, that's communist theory. It's like, no, it's not at all. Because, and that's the irony of it too, is that it was John Paul II that had talked a lot and worked with the solidarity movement within Poland. That was arguably one of the largest social movements ever to combat communism. So it's just, to me, it's funny and ironic. And within that time, that's when I love to be able to engage in those challenging conversations. Because the principle of the universal destination of goods, it's based on the fact that God created everything for everyone. And we are not meant to be hoarding resources strictly for our own benefit. And that's where kind of the right to private property comes in, because the church doesn't negate the right to private property, but because it is a good that's used for individuals and families to fully develop, which is needed. but it's the universal destination of goods that keeps it in check, saying that yes, every person needs to fully develop, but not at the cost of another individual. And that's where kind of this balancing out of resources and recognizing that we are stewards of all of creation and stewards of our wealth. And that's where we are meant to say, okay, I'm doing all right, but I know my neighbor might be across the world or might be right down the street is not doing well. And why is that? And where am I called to engage in how to make sure that this does not continue to happen? And that's what is extremely challenging. And it's not to say that, Pope Francis, he's not the one that created this teaching. He's reinforcing it and reiterating it. And that's where I think also within chapter 3, he harkens back to a lot of his own previous homilies and previous speeches and presentations that he's given. And it's interesting. So look at the footnotes. A lot of people kind of gloss over those, but go back and look at the footnotes, because even though he's referencing some of his own homilies, he goes back further and again references Benedict XVI, John Paul II, and even further than that. And that's where I think that we have a lot of work to do to better understanding the richness of this teaching and how that desire to try and make sure that equitable and just structures are in place so that all people are able to fully develop. That's where I feel called to continue to pursue the common good. And sorry, I know that I could go on forever on this, so I don't really want to.
Well, and it's been a question for me as I think about in my own position, how are we allocating resources? Because it's a question of me and what I'm thinking about. All right, how do we invest in renewable energy projects? How do we create room for impact investment? And there are a lot of avenues where our resources can be beneficial to somebody else's good and not even necessarily where it takes away from us. And so how do we find more of those opportunities to kind of be win-win and help others get what they need? Because it's really, we have enough resources to feed everyone in the world. It's always been just a challenge of distribution. Mm-hmm. And so how do we ensure equitable distribution? How do we ensure that, how do we keep all of the people that we could have, even if they're not in our community, in our hearts? And that's kind of another challenge, is how do we just continue to hold space for people?
Mm-hmm. We have to continue to engage it, though. And sorry, that's my last note on it. Nope. We have to continue to create that space. And that's where I think sometimes those in a social ministry, whether in a parish or a diocese, sometimes it's a lot easier to maintain the status quo. It's a lot easier to say, well, this is how it's always been done, or we're just going to kind of roll into our budget season and not address anything because we don't know what next year is going to look like, because it's post-COVID, still in the midst of COVID. But we have to be our own best advocate, and we have to be advocates for others. And we have to continually engage in that conversation, which is hard to do. And I think it's also challenging, especially when you're working for the institutional church, because sometimes it can that in and of itself can be an uphill battle, because the church also is an institution. Not every institution is perfect, because it's made up of people who are flawed and are sinners as well. So it's just, yes, creating that space and continuing to make sure that we are a voice for the voiceless, and then actually bringing in those people to have their own voice and empowering them to be able to advocate for themselves as well.
Yeah, and that's something I find vital in my own work too, is trying to make sure that the people that are affected by large scale problems in society have a voice at the table, and that the work for me is trying to just take the step back. And I like to talk and be persuasive, and that's why this interview format's actually interesting for me too, because it's kind of like, well, I'm just facilitating the answers coming out from whoever is on the panel, and I think that's a good experience for me. And I I've been enjoying the format. I've learned a lot in this conversation. One more question for you before we either move to small groups or just move to large group Q&A. How do we value the worth of every human being, even if people are not productive or efficient? I know you're doing some work with a Catholic Disabilities Networks. And so I wanted to really kind of touch on this point where he's looking at people with disabilities. So
That is, I'm glad you brought that question up, because actually I've had just two very short stories that for me as a child helped solidify the fact that, every person is different and we need to honor their abilities regardless of whether or not they're productive or normal or all of that. Very early on growing up, when I grew up in southeastern Wisconsin, my mom she was a special ed aide for 40 plus years. And she worked within the public school system early on when the ADA was passed, trying to get the schools ADA compliant. And at the time, and mind you, I grew up in a small, rural, southeastern Wisconsin, not a lot of racial diversity. But a Pakistani Muslim family had moved into the area, and they had the couple they were both physicians, 3 boys, roughly the same age as my siblings and me. And their youngest, Hamza, has cerebral palsy. And he came into the school district in kindergarten, and my mom was assigned to be his aide. And she moved up every single grade with Hamza, starting from kindergarten through senior year in high school. So we became very close with that family. And mind you, my parents, like, they grew up on the north side of Chicago, like your very stereotypical Irish parish, your German parish, like that's your neighborhood, this is your parish. And my mom went to the all girls Catholic school, the white gloves, the uniform, all of that. So like in terms of her like worldly perspective, it was minimal. And Hamza and his family were just so welcoming to us, and we were so welcoming to them, that we learned so much about Pakistani culture. My mother has attended, I don't even know how many different Muslim services with their family. And it's that encounter of being very personal, where we were able to recognize the dignity within that individual, that boy, who, by the way, now is brilliant. Like, he graduated from Stanford Law School. He is just rocking at life. And my mother always jokes like, oh, he's my really successful child. It's like, well, thanks, Mom, for the rest of us.
ouch.
But I know, but within that, it's just, I mean, it was honoring his dignity and learning so much about his culture, his faith, and learning that we are so much more alike than we were different with that. And that's where I think too, US culture in particular, we had struggled so much with this idea of capitalist culture trying to continually work to make more money and that's where now it's trying to work for the American dream. And it's a wonderful idea, but when you are working yourself to the point where you're not honoring the dignity of the worker, and that's why I know Clayton, if you're in his small group potentially, who works for the Catholic Labor Network, will be able to can share about the work that they've been doing to honor workers as well. It has been challenging because if you don't fit a particular mold and you're not as productive as someone else, well, then you're not valuable. Well, that's completely contrary to what our church teaches us, what Pope Francis has reiterated, because we're all children of God. And just because a person is not as productive or not as efficient as someone else does not mean they are any less valuable in the sight of God. And we need to recognize that too. So it's just been in the work that I've been doing with some of the other disability programs and groups. I've been completely humbled and honored and love my time there. And my other quick story too is I remember my uncle, he's been deceased now for about 6 years. He was very engaged with Special Olympics, and he would take my siblings and me every year when we were kids to help volunteer at that. And so those are some of the connections that we started out as a very young age. that we continued to foster as we were growing up through school. And again, it's that encounter, recognizing a face that makes it real for so many individuals. But what Pope Francis is calling us to do within this document is that we don't necessarily have to see the person. They don't have to be right next to us, but we know they exist. We know that they are in our country. We know that they are around the world. And how do we continue to foster a sense of friendship when that person isn't living right next door to us, but they might be across the world? And that's the challenge that he puts forth for all of us.
All right, and that's wonderful, and it's the sense of solidarity for people for people with disabilities. I think that we have a lot of work to do in thinking about that as an American society. I mean, we've definitely placed a lot of pride on work ethic. I mean, when I'm working with, particularly with young adults, the thing I'm most afraid of for most of them is that they're going to work too hard and burn themselves out because they're trying to chase after something which may or may not be desirable or may not be achievable for everyone. Absolutely. And so how do we make sure that people have the basic essentials to live life, even if they can't meet the exceeding higher levels of productivity?
And it's not even like basic levels of life too. It's like the dignity and what we talk about with development and flourishing. And it's different for every individual. And I think that's that balancing act between how do we promote the common good while honoring the unique gifts and talents of every individual person? Because a community is made up of individuals. And if we're only trying to have like one benchmark standard that we're measuring everyone against, it's not going to work. And we're going to alienate people because of that. And that's where I think Pope Francis, through his pontificate, has been so wonderful in saying, like, you need to look to the margins. You need to look to see who is being excluded based off of the structures and benchmarks we've put in place that to try and push forth like efficiency and productivity and wealth gains, which is fine, but not if you're not if it's at the cost of another individual being able to develop themselves.
Right. All right. And that is where we'll leave the interview portion of this evening. So right now I'm going to pause the recording. All right, and welcome back. We've just finished with our small groups with our Fratelli Tutti mini series. And now we are going to get to questions from the people that have attended. So how we will do this is that I will, if you've typed a question in the chat, I will just say who wrote, or I will just actually point it out to you, and then you can read your question for me. So John, you had a question earlier. Yes, you did. So John, if you want to mention your question.
Oh, you're asking me to remember something. What?
Oh, never mind. I found it. So I'll read it since I found it. Okay. So can we sometimes have a parochial love rather than an expansive love? And how does Pope Francis how do you think Pope Francis would deal with this question? Not that you are Pope Francis, but how do you think Pope Francis would deal with this question?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry, I was looking at a different question in the chat and I was like, okay. A good thing of listening. I wasn't listening very well. Sorry.
That's okay. Can we sometimes have a parochial love rather than an expansive love?
I think absolutely. Yes. I mean, in practice, we do. Should we? Not necessarily. I think right now, that's something I think a lot of parishes and dioceses in particular have been struggling with. This idea of, with COVID, self-preservation. People are worried about how do I maintain, the various ministries within my own parish when my envelope and offertory has really been impacted over the past year. And with the limited resources we have now, are we still able to provide our typical outreach grants to some of the organizations who are in greater need, but now we're also in need? And how do you reconcile that? I mean, I'm sure many people here have been aware of that within either their own parish or their own diocese. And I think it's a challenge. And with the parish that I'm at in particular, thankfully, we have been fortunate enough to continue to support and having that more expansive vision and recognizing that we are still doing okay. Even though our envelope and offertory is down, we still need to recognize that we're still doing better than some. We're doing better than our own sister parish, and it's important to continue to support them in any way we can. But it's hard because when challenges are brought to the forefront, and COVID really exacerbated a number of them, many individuals had to try and look at their own budgets, especially when you're talking about allocating resources. And most of the time, it's the giving that off the top that gets cut, because now we need to focus on our own. And that's what's hard, because we're always called to have more of an expansive vision, even in the midst of challenging times. But it's not to say, the church also is an institution. It's a business. We have to keep our lights on. And I mean, I know our sister parish, they need a new roof on a 100-year-old building. Like, capital projects are really expensive. And when it's in an impoverished neighborhood, trying to raise that dollar amount is multi-year undertaking. And then when you have COVID and your envelope and offertory goes down even more, it's a real challenge. So I know I sit in a place of privilege at the parish I work at, and I am grateful at least that we have the vision to continue to look out instead of in.
John.
I just wanted to add, when you're talking about self-preservation and budgets, do you think that sometimes we don't have an evangelical love, which is expansive because of we're called to share the joy of the gospel, but so much of our training in our institutions are not geared to sharing the love of the gospel, or even preparing parishioners to live that gospel out in the world.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, John, right now, because I was just having a conversation today at my parish, and one of the projects that I started out recognizing that, mind you, the Archdiocese went through a massive undertaking survey through, I can't even remember the name of the institute, but it was called the Disciple Maker Index. And I don't even want to know how much it was spent to get that data on it. But the interesting piece of data that came out of it that has really stuck with me is the fact that even though the vast majority of respondents from our particular parish, which is large, it's 2,400 families, typical or stereotypical kind of suburban neighborhood, the vast majority of respondents said that they feel supported in the parish. They feel like they're growing in their faith, that they would recommend our parish to another, a family member or a friend. But almost the same percentage is also not comfortable talking about their own personal faith story, or they have not shared their own faith story in the last, I think it was like 6 months, the question was asked. So one of the projects then that I wanted to try and institute, utilizing Zoom and video technologies, called Witness Wednesdays, of getting a parishioner to do just a short, 7-minute interview about, tell me a little bit about yourself. What has your faith life meant to you? And what particular ministry you have been drawn to, or that's been attractive to you. So these are softball questions, and it is like pulling teeth to get people to talk about their own faith journey, because it's so personal. And I think that's to your point, John, is that we have not done a good job of training individuals to share the gospel message of Christ and what Christ has meant in our own individual lives. For me, I love Catholic social teaching. I love the fact that my relationship with Christ is what compels me to embrace these challenging topics and want to talk about them. That might look different. Like, what compels somebody else to move forward in their faith might look a little different. Catholic social teaching isn't for everybody, but you should still be called to do something. And we're all called to proclaim the gospel. but it's just, gosh. And at first I was like, oh, I can do this weekly. This will be great. I am struggling to get people to commit to do this, to have one done a month. And I'm just in conversations today with my associate pastor and my communications director of how do we make this, I don't want to say palatable, but how do we encourage people to talk more about what their faith life has meant to them? And we had a couple of ideas about, identifying, similar to what kind of Adam had said in my introduction of like, this is what I've seen in you. I have seen you be a disciple in this way. Could you share a little bit more about what that means? And again, when we're able to convey that message and share that with other individuals, that's evangelization at work, because we're sharing the story of Christ, but also what Christ has meant to us.
Well, see, another thing too is like I have a friend of mine. He lost his sight in one of his eyes, but what he did is he talked to a vendor, not just for himself, but for other people who use that product. So in a way, that's an indirect way of him living his faith and evangelizing. And maybe that's another thing we need to evangelizing. Isn't what did St. Francis say? Spread the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things too, is as Catholics, we can evangelize just in our day-to-day lives. And to me, that's another question I have, like for parishes, would be how does Sunday Mass prepare you for the rest of the week? And, just kind of, well, how does the church staff, how are you living it in the world? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're hooked up with an issue, but you're maybe hooked up with an issue in a totally different way. Where you're advocating for good working conditions for your employees, or working conditions for yourself and your fellow employees, or access to healthcare, those kinds of things, but not necessarily have it where it's under the banner of a Catholic organization, but they're just out in the streets living their faith.
Yeah. And it brings up the interesting idea of, we as Catholics have a very interesting challenge of being followers and leaders at the same time. And so when we have to think about, we follow Christ, but our goal is to lead the change we want in the world and sharing the good news of Christ. Are we equipped to do that? How do we do that? How do we find the people that can be those teachers and to keep us growing and keep us able to actually use our gain and develop leadership skills? I think that's the wording I'm looking for, is how do we gain and develop leadership skills? And in parish, I think that's a great place to do that. Though I will say, in a parish of 2,400 families, that's a little sad that you can barely get one a month for like community witness. That's rough.
It is. I mean, if anybody has any other insight on I am all for some brainstorming on this, because it definitely was surprising to me. And I think a lot of it also is to email communications, trying to get people on the phone. I guess I probably understated or underestimated how easy it could have been. Cause I'm like, well, everybody's at home. They're not doing, like, everybody's got to have extra time on their hands now. And that was also completely inaccurate. So learning myself with that has been fun, but.
I think we got time for one more question before we close. All right, I see Patrice put a link to a document called Everyday Christianity to Hunger and Thirst for Justice from the USCCB. So
the one other, I'm trying to scan if there was any other questions on here.
There was, go ahead.
Oh, the other one I was just looking at, it was also posted from John earlier about, along with like time and space, like the need to be aware of the method or the medium in which we are communicating or creating that space, whether we're doing it face to face or social media, and how do we do that? And I think, that's something that Pope Francis has articulated too, about just the caution of overutilizing social media, which is really hard to do given COVID, when we are not able to meet in person, or if you are meeting in person, you're socially distanced, wearing a mask, which feels very unnatural, especially like when you're trying to create a space to dialogue and to listen. There's a level of vulnerability and intimacy that needs to happen in that. And you don't do that easily when you're 6 feet apart, wearing a mask and not able to see a person's face. So I've been able to utilize Zoom better, to have one-on-ones. And I don't have any scientific research to back this up, but I have also been very pleasantly surprised at the level of honesty and vulnerability that people have expressed over Zoom, which typically has not happened in some of even like my parish commission meetings previously. And maybe it's because they're in the comfort of their own home. Maybe it's because there's a level of separation with the computer. But I have been pleasantly surprised at the level of, like I said, vulnerability and honesty that we've been able to convey utilizing an electronic platform. Now, the caution I think that Pope Francis has emphasized and reiterated over and over again is that social media unchecked can also, that's where we saw so much hate, so much violence, and defamation, and just going rampant on there, because there is that level of separation and you're not seeing a person face to face, and that impact. So it's that balancing act of how do we use these tools and methods in a productive, life-giving way versus one that is going to harm another individual.
Another thing somebody had said in this day of so much Zoom is, if you just want to talk to one other person, sometimes using a phone is more intimate, and allows the kind of focus and connection that we're used to, in a way that too much technology can sometimes get in the way of the basic human connection that we're really all searching for.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. Because it's like, we don't need to, we complicate things. I am like the queen of overcomplicating and over planning and doing this. And it's like, keep it simple. Phone calls also works really well.
Yeah. Even as an intensely introverted person myself, and I definitely have found, even after a year of pandemic and social distancing, I'm like, I'm starting to go crazy. Even as the intensely introverted side. Now I'll say that in probably about an hour, I'll be like, oh, hey, I get to be by myself for a while, and that's great after a long work day. But so I think that's what we have for our program tonight. We're grateful you could all come to this part 2 of the Fratelli Tutti series. I know this can be late in the evening for some people, and we are looking forward to having you all come for part 3. Part 3 will take place. Let me check my date one more time. Part 3 of our Fratelli Tutti series, going over chapters 4 and 5, will be Tuesday, March 23rd from 7 to 8:30 p.m. You will all, since you are all registered, you will all get an email link with the Zoom a few days ahead of time, and then again we will do one the day of. Also, if you're interested in being on a distribution list for the Center for Mission Events, please feel free to email me and include that too, because we're seeing if we want to start a distribution list for any further events and conversations we might plan. Chapter readings for Fratelli Tutti's next session will be chapters 4 and 5. Chapters 4 and 5 if you are reading and following along. All right, and thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful night.